you actually unearthed, I think, with one of your researchers, Jack Hazelwood, who I also know, so we'll give him a little shout out here. You became aware of a submission, I think it was in 2011, to the Biological Weapons Convention that the Chinese regime gave, and then Jack unearthed this, and it's an incredibly fascinating document, and like what's in there is kind of, I was stunned to see that such a thing was submitted by the CCP to a international body. Tell me a little bit, and people can read to find out more.
Yeah. Well, first I have to give credit to Miles Yu here again, because when Miles Yu was looking into this subject for Mike Pompeo, he found out that there was a Chinese government submission to the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention in 2011, and he found reference to it in another document, and it had the subheadings that were included in the Chinese government submission, but he wasn't able to get hold of the submission itself, and he then passed on the details of it to the State Department, to Dave Asher and their team, but they weren't able to get hold of the document itself. But after Miles told me about it, and after he showed me what the headlines were, things like man-made synthetic viruses, and I was desperate to get hold of the document. So I had Jack Hazelwood and another, I had these amazing researchers who were helping uncover things in the depths of the internet for me that I don't know how to do. Another researcher as well, they went searching for it. And Jack was able to uncover the document. It had never been reported on before, ever. And it is the most, seriously, terrifying. It is the single most terrifying document I have ever read in my entire life. And I include the details of it in the book. It was literally mind-blowing and shocking, because it details, and this is, bearing in mind, the official Chinese government submission to the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention in 2011. That might sound like a long time ago, but they only have these conventions every 5 or 6 years. I think it's every 5 years. And their next submission in 2016 was very pared back. There was basically no detail in it. So this was their last detailed submission. And in it, they talk about the developments in technology. They talk about how, in terms of man-made viruses, in terms of viruses that have the ability to infect specific races, specific DNA, specific genes. They talk about how the synthetic biological research can pose and I quote, a latent threat to mankind. They talk about the risks of doing this research specifically, and how it can cause a pandemic that could end mankind. I mean, literally, this is the most shocking document anyone can ever read, right? And this is the official Chinese government submission. I don't know what to say other than it is so horrifying, and I don't know why the United Nations officials, when they received that back in 2011, why China wasn't immediately held in breach of violations of the Biological Weapons Convention, and why we weren't paying closer attention. And this is just, I think this is the overall story. There were so many warnings here. I mean, look, I don't know what could have been done, but at least we should have been aware what China was doing, what research they were doing.
Well, and so there's this interesting twist here. Under the Obama administration, the gain-of-function research, which, by the way, it would be great if you could just briefly explain what that means in a little more detail, because it's people hear it all the time, but it's not necessarily obvious. Under the Obama administration, there was a moratorium put on the U.S. being involved in gain-of-function research, but in 2017, from what I understand, NIH sort of changed that designation, and apparently quietly. It was sort of unknown by most of the people you spoke with.
Yeah, so obviously we've seen the debate now between Rand Paul and Anthony Fauci, and there are now different definitions being thrown about for gain of function. But just putting this really simply, gain of function is research that can increase the transmissibility of a virus, meaning it can make it more infectious, or can make it more lethal, more deadly. Why it's called gain of function is because the virus can gain new functions. For example, the ability to infect humans when it could not infect humans previously, or say the ability to become airborne. So in effect, you're taking a pre-existing virus, giving it new abilities, and then you end up with a new virus that is more lethal, more deadly, more dangerous. The scientists who were arguing for this research say that it can help prevent a pandemic. Anthony Fauci, I found out, was one of the most senior officials, government officials, who were proponents of gain of function, who was a proponent of gain of function research. And I found a paper he wrote for MBio, the medical journal, in 2012, where he writes in this paper that gain of function research can cause a pandemic. And he talks about, especially if the research is conducted in a sloppy laboratory somewhere in the world where there's no oversight. I mean, it's almost prophetic. But he argues that, and this at the time there was debate about whether or not to ban gain of function research. This is in 2012, and then the Obama administration did ban it 2 years later. So in this paper, he's admitting that it can cause a pandemic, but he argued that the risks were worth it for the benefits that it can bring, which is seeing which viruses could cause a pandemic. Now, it's important to note that many, many, many scientists have strongly and publicly argued that there is no proof that any of this work, gain of function work, there's no proof that it has ever been able to prevent a pandemic. Creating new viruses, they say, does not help to prevent a pandemic, and they were arguing really strongly against it. That's why a ban was introduced, or more technically correct, it was a pause of gain of function research in 22 fields, including with coronaviruses, with MERS, with influenza viruses. Now, in 2017, this pause was lifted. This was under the Trump administration. Now, my understanding from my reporting is that this was done in a meeting with the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this is technically a White House bureau, but it was relatively junior officials, I'm told, who were there. Anthony Fauci was supporting the lift. He was behind or supporting the ban on gain of function being lifted. And it seems that no one knew that this had taken place. And I interviewed a lot of people about this and asked them if they knew, and they're on the record in the book. You know, people like National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, Matt Pottinger, Mike Pompeo, all of this, no one knew he had lifted the ban on this research. No one even had heard of the research really until it started emerging in media reports well after the pandemic.
So did you reach out to Dr. Fauci for comments?
Of course. Unfortunately, he only seems to agree to interviews with journalists he knows are going to be friendly and supportive. He has done interviews with the ABC here in Australia, so it's not just that I'm in Australia, and those interviews were incredibly soft. So I think you'll notice that he doesn't agree to media interviews where he's going to get a hard time or be interrogated in any way. So he did not agree, or his media advisors knocked back every single approach I made, including, even commenting on specific queries.
Our team also reached out to Dr. Anthony Fauci about his position on gain-of-function research, but we did not immediately receive a response. I want to talk briefly about something in the documentary that you made alongside the book. You interview President Trump, 45, so to speak, and you basically ask him why he thinks that the Wuhan Institute of Virology may be, involved. And he says there were body bags outside of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's a fascinating kind of moment, and you ask for clarification, and you get further clarification from Secretary Pompeo. And so tell me a little bit about this and what verification you've done around this. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I was so keen to interview President Donald Trump was to ask him, in April 2020, he said there was evidence that the virus leaked from a laboratory. He said that at a press conference where a journalist from Fox News asked him about it. So he didn't make a big song and dance of holding a press conference to say this virus has come from a lab. He was responding to a question at a press conference, and he said, yes, there is evidence to indicate that it leaked from the lab. But he's never really gone into detail about what evidence he saw that convinced him of the case for a lab leak. And so that was one of the really important things I wanted to ask him about when I sat down and interviewed him. And so he said, and it was quite a stunning admission because, as you know, I've been reporting on this very closely, and I have never heard of bodies being dumped outside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that was what he said. He said he had seen evidence or been told evidence that there were body bags dumped outside the Wuhan lab. And I clarified that he did mean outside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He said, yes, that's what he heard a long time ago. And then I asked if that was information given from the intelligence agencies, and he was deliberately vague, and he didn't say where he'd heard it from. Luckily, with the way my interviews were timed, I was interviewing Secretary Pompeo. I'd already spoken to him for the book, but I was interviewing him for the documentary a couple of weeks later. So I was able to ask him. I said to him that President Trump had told me about the body bags, and was this accurate? And Secretary Pompeo's response was that presidents have the ability to talk about things that some of the rest of us don't. And that was a very interesting answer. And it indicated that there might have been something behind it. I then made more inquiries of a very senior confidential source in the intelligence community about this piece of evidence in particular, because before including it in the documentary, I just thought it would be helpful to know whether this was intelligence or not, just other information that the former president had seen elsewhere. And I did get confirmation from a very senior intelligence source that this was intelligence, that there were bodies outside the Wuhan lab, but that it had been assigned a low confidence assessment, meaning it couldn't be verified through other sources. Now, bearing in mind, most of the evidence in this space does not have a high confidence assessment. So you saw that when Joe Biden released the results or the analysis with his intelligence probe, his 90-day probe, many of the agencies that said this was a natural virus, they did so with a low confidence level, a low confidence assessment. There was only one agency that had a medium moderate confidence level, and that was for the case of a lab leak. So I think when you're dealing with human sources coming out of Wuhan, I think that information is very difficult to verify. And that's why when I interviewed President Trump, he said to me that great line, and he said, well, knowing you, maybe you can figure it out. So it was something that he was saying I should go on to investigate further.
Yeah, so let's talk about the fact that this all happened under the Trump administration and the kind of reaction to President Trump saying that a lab leak was a possibility. And, you go kind of into great detail of even how that is actually one of the dimensions. There were a lot of people who just reflexively went and said, ostensibly, if President Trump said it, the opposite must be true, almost.
The way this issue was politicized last year is shocking. It's deplorable. This is such a crucial question, how the first pandemic in our lifetimes started. It's changed our lives forever. Nothing will ever be the same again, not to mention the 4.7 million people who have died. So you'd think getting to the bottom of this would be more important than anything, than politics, and yet it wasn't. And the reality is that this issue played out during an election year in the United States, the most politically divisive place on earth, probably. And so it's very hard to separate how this issue was treated from that election cycle. And so you had the scientific community not wanting to give any credence to what Trump was saying, even though, as I pointed out, Trump was just responding to a question at a press conference initially. So you had that play out in the scientific community. You had it play out in a major way in the media. I mean, the mainstream media outlets, they just backed the fact that this was, they called it a conspiracy theory. They were siding with the likes of Peter Daszak, giving him so much airtime. Really disgraceful. And even people who were reporting on it, I mean, this even got politicized in Australia. Like, I was reporting on it, and the left-leaning public broadcaster here, the ABC, insisted this was a conspiracy, and they were attacking me for just reporting on this story, reporting on the fact that the intelligence agencies were investigating a lab leak. So this issue was very politicized. I mean, Sir Richard Dearlove in the book, he uses the phrase that President Trump's comments contaminated the issue. And like, I understand his point. Coming from Britain, he thought Trump contaminated the issue. But I also think that presidents and secretaries of state and other politicians do have a responsibility to tell the truth. And they do have a responsibility to be transparent with the American people. And I mean, what was Trump meant to do? Cover up the fact that there is evidence that pointed to a lab leak, which there was. We know there was intelligence that pointed to a lab leak. It was later declassified. So what was he meant to do? Lie to the American people? I mean, that's just preposterous.